Welcome to WikiPodcast.
And welcome back. This is the second and final part of our mini-series on medieval and religious philosophy.
That's right. Today, we're diving deep, really deep, into Thomas Aquinas and his, incredibly ambitious project.
Synthesizing Aristotle with Christian doctrine, it's huge.
Exactly. We've got a lot to unpack here. His life, his major works, his core philosophical and theological ideas.
Yeah, our goal is really to pull out the key pieces of that synthesis, show how he tried to harmonize faith and reason.
And for you, our listener, we want this deep dive to give you a clear, hopefully engaging grasp of what Aquinas was all about.
We're aiming for those aha moments, right, where Aristotelian logic clicks with Christian revelation.
Without getting bogged down in overly academic stuff. We'll respect your time.
Okay, so where do we start? His life, maybe?
Yeah, let's set the scene.
Yeah.
Thomas was born around 1225 in Rocca Secca, Italy. Noble family.
And they had plans for him, big plans.
Definitely. He was meant to become an abbot, follow his uncle at Monte Cassino.
Which was, a pretty standard path for a younger son of nobility in southern Italy back then. He started there really young, like 5 years old.
But then things got complicated. Military conflict around the abbey.
Right, so he ended up moving to the University of Naples, which was relatively new, founded by Emperor Frederick II.
And Naples, this is crucial, isn't it? This is likely where he first bumps into Aristotle.
Absolutely. Aristotle, but also the commentators, Averroes, Maimonides, hugely influential figures.
These ideas just completely reshaped his thinking, didn't they?
They really did. His teacher there, Petrus de Ibernia, was teaching Aristotle using Averroes' commentaries. These texts were only recently translated.
So it was a real hotbed of rediscovered ideas.
Exactly. Naples, under Frederick II, was this melting pot Greek philosophy preserved by Arabic and Jewish scholars flowing back into the West. You can see how that exposure was fundamental for someone trying to bridge different traditions later on.
But his family wasn't on board with his intellectual path, were they?
Not at all. When he decided, at 19, to join the Dominicans, a new mendicant order, well, they strongly opposed it.
To the point of basically kidnapping him.
Right.
Locked him up in their castles.
For almost a year, it really shows his commitment. There's that famous story, too.
Oh, the prostitute.
Yeah, his brothers tried to tempt him, break his vow of chastity. He supposedly grabbed a burning log from the fire to chase her out.
Wow. Talk about resolve.
And then, the story goes, angels appeared and gave him a mystical girdle of chastity. Whether literal or symbolic, it paints a picture of his determination.
So how did he get out?
Eventually, his mother, Theodora, seems to have realized he wouldn't budge. She arranged for him to escape through a window, sort of saving face for the family while letting him follow his calling.
Clever. And then off to Paris and Cologne.
Yes, to study under Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great, a massive intellectual figure himself.
And Albert saw something in the quiet Aquinas. The dumb ox story.
That's the one. Albert apparently said, "You call him the dumb ox, but in his teaching he will one day produce such a bellowing that it will be heard throughout the world." He saw the potential.
Albert's influence must have been huge too, right? He was big on Aristotle.
Immense. Albert was key in reintroducing Aristotle to the Latin West. He appointed Aquinas Magister Studentium, basically a senior teaching assistant.
And Aquinas started teaching.
On the Old Testament initially, commentaries on Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations.
Then back to Paris, master's degree, started writing his own major stuff.
Right. The Ante et Essentia on being and essence comes from this period. Really fundamental work. He also had to defend the mendicant orders.
Right, there was pushback against them.
Yeah, from figures like William of Santa Moore. So his first teaching stint in Paris, 1256, 1259, was super productive.
That's when he started the Summa Contra Gentile.
Began developing it, yes.
Yeah.
And wrote the Questiones Disputate de Veritate, disputed questions on truth. Big stuff.
And he was friends with Bonaventure around this time, another giant.
Friends, yes, though they had different takes on faith and reason. Bonaventure leaned more heavily on faith, you could say.
Interesting. And Aquinas was advising King Louis the Knights, too.
He was. Shows the kind of respect he commanded even beyond the university.
Then he moved around again. Italy, mostly. Naples, Orvieto, Rome.
Yep, from 1259 to 1268, another incredibly fruitful time. Finished the Summa Contra Gentiles.
Wrote the Catena Aurea.
The Golden Chain, yeah. A massive commentary pulling together quotes from church fathers on the Gospels. Very useful.
And the hymns. For Corpus Christi, Pangia Lingua, Panis Angelicus.
Beautiful, aren't they? Still used today. It shows his range not just dense philosophy, but deep devotional writing, too. He also wrote Contra Eras Graecorum then.
Against the errors of the Greeks. Aimed at.
Trying to bridge the gap with the Eastern Church. theological debates, reconciliation efforts.
Then back to Paris for a second round.
1269 to 1272, and this time was maybe tougher.
Because of Averroism.
Exactly. Interpretations of Aristotle, especially by fetches like Seeger of Brabant, were causing controversy. Ideas like the unity of the intellect.
The idea that all humans share one single intellect.
Right, which clashed with individual immortality and responsibility. Aquinas tackled this head-on in De Unitate Intellectus contra Averroistas.
Defending his view of how Aristotle should be understood in line with Christianity.
Precisely. But the atmosphere was tense. The Bishop of Paris actually condemned a set of Aristotelian and Averroistic propositions in 1270, and more famously later in 1277, after Aquinas' death.
So Aquinas was right in the thick of these debates.
Absolutely. His final years, though, were back in Naples from 1272.
Setting up a Dominican study house, a studium generale, still working on the big one, the Summa Theologiae.
He was. But then, in December 1273, something happened.
The mystical experience.
During Mass, yeah. We don't know exactly what happened, but afterwards he told his friend Reginald, "I can write no more. All that I have written seems like straw to me."
Just stopped.
Yeah. Left the Summa Theologiae, his masterpiece, unfinished. It's profound, isn't it? Suggests some kind of direct encounter that put his own writings into perspective.
And he died not long after.
On his way to the Second Council of Lyon in 1274, he fell ill, stopped at the Cistercian Abbey of Fossanova, and passed away there.
His final words were apparently about his work on the Eucharist. A fitting end.
It really was. Okay, so that's the life. Now, the big synthesis.
Yes. Reason and revelation. How did he see them fitting together?
As complementary, this is key. He believes truth comes from God, and God reveals it in two ways. Through reason, which is natural revelation.
What we can figure out using our own minds about the world and, to some extent, about God.
Exactly. And then there's supernatural revelation, faith. Truths revealed through Scripture, through the Church, that go beyond what reason alone can grasp.
Like the Trinity. Or the Incarnation.
Precisely. Reason can lead us towards God, show us that God exists, some of his attributes, but faith reveals the deeper mysteries. They don't contradict, they complete each other.
Okay. And this leads to his arguments for God's existence, the famous 5 ways.
The Quincviae, rational demonstrations. He was a big believer in natural theology, what reason can tell us about God.
So, way 1, motion. Things move, right?
Right. Everything moving is moved by something else. You can't have an infinite chain of movers.
Because then nothing would ever start moving in the first place.
Exactly. So there must be a first unmoved mover, and that, Aquinas says, is God.
Makes sense. Way 2, causation. Similar logic.
Very similar. We see cause and effect everywhere. Nothing causes itself. Again, you can't have an infinite regress of causes.
So there must be a first uncaused cause.
Which we call God.
Okay. Way 3, possibility and necessity. This one's a bit more abstract.
A little. We see things that exist but could not exist, contingent things. They come and go.
Like us, or this table.
Right. Now, if everything were merely contingent, it's possible that at some point nothing existed.
And if nothing existed, nothing could ever start existing.
Correct. Since things clearly do exist now, there must be something that exists necessarily, something that cannot not exist.
And that necessary being
Is God.
Got it. Way 4, gradation. Degrees of perfection.
Yeah. We observe that things have different degrees of goodness, truth, nobility, etc.
Some things are better or truer than others.
Right. This implies a maximum, a standard of perfection against which we measure these degrees.
The ultimate good, the ultimate true.
And that perfect standard is God.
And finally, way 5, design or governance. The teleological argument.
We see things in nature, even things without intelligence, like plants or rocks, acting towards an end, following certain laws, showing order.
Like acorns growing into oaks or planets orbiting the sun.
Exactly. This purposeful behavior suggests they're being directed by an intelligent being.
The grand designer.
That director, that intelligence ordering the universe, is God.
So those are the 5 ways, rational pointers to God's existence.
And then he talks about God's nature, often using the via negativa, the negative way.
Saying what God is not.
Right, because God is beyond our full comprehension. So God is simple, not made of parts, perfect, lacking nothing, infinite, unlimited, immutable, unchanging.
And 1, There's only one God.
Exactly. And he connects this powerfully to God's revelation to Moses, I am who I am.
He saw that as God's essence, to exist.
Yes. God is pure being, ipse actus essendi subsistence, the sheer act of existing, not dependent on anything else, pure actuality.
Okay, shifting gears slightly, creation. God created ex nihilo out of nothing. Standard Christian doctrine.
Yes. But Aquinas adds a nuance. He thought reason could show that God created, but not necessarily that the world had a beginning in time.
Oh, interesting. So the idea of a temporal beginning is known through faith.
That was his view. Reason alone couldn't rule out an eternally created universe, even though faith tells us it did have a beginning. He also engaged with ideas like spontaneous generation.
Life from non-life. Common idea back then.
Yeah, and even ancient Greek ideas about random mutations producing strange creatures. He saw these as possible imperfections in nature, but not part of God's primary intended order.
Right. Let's move into ethics. Natural law. What's the starting point?
The very first principle of practical reason. Good is to be done and pursued, and evil is to be avoided.
And he thought this was self-evident, discoverable by reason.
Yes, like a fundamental axiom of morality. From this, we derive more specific precepts based on our natural inclinations.
Like what?
Well, first, the inclination we share with all beings, self-preservation, stay alive.
Okay.
Second, inclinations we share with other animals, procreation, raising offspring.
Makes sense.
And third, inclinations unique to us as rational beings, to live in society, to know the truth, especially about God.
And these inclinations, guided by reason, tell us what's good.
They point us towards the basic goods that constitute human flourishing. Natural law is basically reason directing us towards these goods.
And virtue plays a big role here.
Huge. Virtue is a good habit, a perfection of a power, enabling us to consistently act well towards our proper end.
He also talks about synderesis. What's that?
Think of it as the innate basic awareness of the first principles of natural law, like an inbuilt moral spark or compass. It can't be totally extinguished, even if our reasoning about specific actions gets clouded.
Okay. And the virtues themselves.
Yeah.
Cardinal and theological.
Right. The four cardinal virtues, prudence, practical wisdom, justice, fortitude, courage, and temperance, moderation, can be developed through reason and practice.
Human effort.
Yeah. But then there are the three theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, love, which are infused by God's grace. They orient us directly towards God.
And charity is the big one.
Charity is the form of all virtues, he says. It perfects and directs all the others, including the cardinal ones, towards our ultimate end union with God.
He also laid out 4 kinds of law. Let's quickly run through them.
Okay. First, eternal law. God's rational plan for the whole universe. God's wisdom ordering everything.
The ultimate blueprint.
Kind of. Second, natural law. Our participation as rational creatures in that eternal law. Discerning good and evil through reason.
What we've been talking about.
Yep. Third, human law. Specific laws made by human societies, like traffic laws, property laws. These should be derived from and consistent with natural law to be just.
Applications of natural law.
Right. And fourth, divine law. Revealed law given directly by God, like the Ten Commandments or the teachings of Christ in the Gospels. This guides us specifically towards our supernatural end, eternal life, which reason alone can't fully map out.
Got it. And his thoughts on justice in society.
He talked about legal or general justice. That's the individual's duty to contribute to the common good.
Paying taxes, obeying just laws.
Things like that. Then there's distributive justice, how the community distributes goods and burdens fairly to individuals.
And commutative justice.
That's justice between individuals. Fairness in exchanges, contracts, restitution for harm done.
And he famously condemned usury, lending money at interest.
Strongly. He saw it as charging for something that doesn't really exist time, or charging twice for the same thing. Basically, unjust gain.
Okay, politics. Man is a social animal.
By nature, yes. We need community to flourish. Echoes of Aristotle there, of course.
And he distinguished between a good man and a good citizen. What's the significance of that?
It suggests our ultimate moral compass isn't just the state. Being a good person, oriented towards God and virtue, might sometimes require actions or stances different from what the state demands, hinting at individual conscience and autonomy.
What about forms of government? He had a preference?
He thought monarchy was potentially the best if the king is virtuous because it mirrors God's single rule over the universe.
Yeah.
Efficient, unified.
The downside.
Big downside. If the monarch becomes corrupt, it turns into tyranny, which he considered the absolute worst form of government. Power corrupts.
So checks on power were needed.
Definitely. He also suggested that sometimes tolerating a tyrant might be better than the chaos and anarchy that could result from overthrowing them, a pragmatic point.
And the relationship between secular rulers and the church.
Rulers are God's representatives in temporal matters, but they are subordinate to the church, specifically the Pope, in spiritual matters, doctrine, and ethics.
What about slavery?
He argued it wasn't man's natural state according to the primary intention of natural law, but he distinguished this natural state from servile slavery arising from sin or circumstances like war or debt, which he seemed to accept as part of the fallen world, though not ideal. A complex and debated area.
And the death penalty.
He allowed for it, judicially imposed by legitimate authority, but only under strict conditions and for the common good, like removing a dangerous threat to society.
Just war theory, too.
Yes, building on Augustine, conditions included just cause, like defense, legitimate authority declaring it, and right intention, aiming for peace, not vengeance or conquest.
Okay, let's hit some key theological points quickly. Sin.
Contrary to eternal law, a falling short, a privation of the good that ought to be there, not a positive thing in itself.
The Trinity.
3 distinct persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, sharing one single divine essence or nature, interrelated, co-equal, co-eternal, central mystery.
Prima causa, first cause.
Connects back to the 5 ways. God as the ultimate uncaused source of all being and motion.
Yes.
Fully God and fully human, 2 natures united in one person. The incarnation was necessary to restore human nature, damaged by sin. He leaned towards a satisfaction theory of atonement. Christ's sacrifice satisfied the justice of God, paying the debt of sin. His understanding also implies divine kenosis, God the Son emptying himself to become human.
Goal of human life.
Union with God. Eternal fellowship, achieved fully in the afterlife through the beatific vision, seeing God face to face. This requires grace and ordering our lives towards charity, peace, holiness.
What about his views on heretics? This is often brought up.
It's complex and, frankly, uncomfortable for modern readers. He saw heresy as incredibly serious a corruption of faith, worse than counterfeit money, he argued.
So deserving punishment.
Yes, he believed unrepentant heretics, after warnings, could be excommunicated by the church and then handed over to secular authorities for punishment, potentially including death. He saw it as protecting the community's spiritual health.
But the church itself didn't execute.
No, that was key. Handed over to the secular arm. But he still advocated for this outcome in persistent cases. It's important to note his context, but also not to excuse the harshness.
Did he view Jews differently?
Yes. He argued against forced conversion and for toleration of Jewish practices within limits. He also strongly argued against forcibly baptizing Jewish children.
On what grounds?
Natural justice. Before the age of reason, children belong to their parents' care, and forced baptism violates that natural bond and parental authority.
Magic and demons.
Only God performs true miracles, suspending natural laws. Angels and demons work within the laws of nature, albeit in ways beyond human capacity. Magicians, he thought, derived power not from spells themselves, but by invoking demons.
So his views were later used in witch hunts.
Tragically, yes. While his own comments were more theoretical about demonic influence, his authority was later cited in texts like the Malleus Maleficarum to justify persecution, something he likely never envisioned, a difficult legacy there.
And the afterlife. Soul and body.
The soul is the form of the body, immortal, it survives death. But complete human fulfillment requires the resurrection of the body at the end of time. We are body-soul composites.
So rewards and punishments are both spiritual and eventually bodily.
That's the idea, complete restoration of the person.
Okay, so his influence. Despite all this work, it wasn't immediately universally accepted?
No, there was that condemnation of 1277 in Paris shortly after his death, targeting certain Aristotelian ideas, some associated with him. It was a temporary setback, though.
But then canonization relatively soon after.
1323. And Dante puts him in paradise in the Divine Comedy, which says a lot about his growing stature.
That saying at his canonization, taught miraculous, quote, articulus.
As many miracles as articles in his Summa, a testament to the perceived power and truth of his writings, then declared a doctor of the church.
And the second scholasticism later really revived interest.
Big time. In the 16th and 17th centuries, thinkers like Cajetan and Suarez built extensively on his work.
Then the 19th century brings neo-scholasticism.
Right. A major push to make Aquinas the standard for Catholic philosophy and theology. Pope Leo III's encyclical Aeterni Patris in 1879 was pivotal.
Declared him patron of Catholic schools.
Exactly, cemented his position. Even 20th century movements like the Nouvelle Theology, while different from neo-scholasticism, still deeply engaged with Aquinas.
And he's still central in Catholic thought today.
Very much so. Heavily cited in the official catechism, praised by recent popes. His influence extends beyond Catholicism, too.
In philosophy.
Ethics, particularly virtue ethics. Thinkers like Alistair MacIntyre, Philippa Foot owe a lot to his framework. Also, the principle of double effect that's heavily Thomistic.
It pops up in unexpected places too, doesn't it? Neuroscience.
Literature. Yeah. Walter Freeman saw links with neurodynamics. Henry Adams compared his system to Gothic cathedrals. James Joyce used his aesthetic ideas. Umberto Eco, too. His reach is wide.
Of course, there are critics. Bertrand Russell's point.
Russell famously argued Aquinas wasn't really doing open-ended philosophy, but rather starting with Catholic dogma and finding ways to rationalize it using Aristotle. That his conclusions were fixed beforehand.
A common criticism.
It is. Whether you agree or not, it's part of the conversation around him.
So wrapping this up, what's the big takeaway?
Aquinas' synthesis was, well, monumental. A staggering attempt to integrate the best of Greek philosophy with Christian revelation. Whether you think he fully succeeded or not, the effort itself shaped Western thought profoundly.
His work is still incredibly relevant, sparking debate, inspiring people across so many fields.
Absolutely. And here's where it gets really interesting. Thinking about this vast system he built, ethics, politics, metaphysics, theology, all aimed at harmonizing reason and faith. How do you, our listener, see the relevance of that project today in our world, which often seems more secular, more driven by science? Is there still a place for this kind of synthesis? Can reason and faith fruitfully interact now?
That's a great question to ponder.
Definitely something to think about.
Thanks for listening. Write us in the comments your opinion on the episode and what other topics you would like us to talk about. Subscribe to the channel to help us reach more listeners. Thank you and have an amazing day.